In 1867, a British Army officer named Charles Warren lowered himself on a rope into a shaft he had dug beneath the streets of Jerusalem and found himself standing in a tunnel that no living person had entered for centuries. Warren was not looking for treasure. He was conducting an archaeological survey for the Palestine Exploration Fund, mapping the underground structures beneath the Temple Mount. What he found in those tunnels, the shafts, the cisterns, the passageways cut through bedrock by hands that had been dust for 2,000 years, was enough to convince him that beneath the most contested piece of real estate on earth lay something that had been hidden deliberately, methodically, and with extraordinary care. He never found what he was looking for. Nobody has. And that absence, that specific and pointed absence of something that every historical source insists should be there, is one of the most extraordinary mysteries in the history of human civilization. Solomon's Temple was, by every account that survives, one of the most astonishing structures ever built. The first book of Kings describes it in obsessive detail: the cedar and cypress wood imported from Lebanon, the stone cut and dressed before it arrived at the building site so that no iron tool was heard during construction, the walls overlaid with pure gold, the two enormous bronze pillars at the door named Yashin and Boaz, the molten sea supported by 12 bronze oxen, and at the very center, in the innermost chamber called the Holy of Holies, an object so sacred that only one person on earth was permitted to approach it, and only once a year: the Ark of the Covenant. And then in 586 BCE, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple, and carried the people of Judah into exile. The books of Kings and Chronicles describe the sack of the temple in detail. They list the objects the Babylonians took: the bronze pillars, the bronze sea, the basins, the pots and shovels and snuffers and dishes. They are extraordinarily specific about what was taken. They never mention the ark. The most sacred object in the entire Israelite religious tradition simply disappears from the historical record sometime before the Babylonian conquest. The last time it is mentioned as being in the temple is during the reign of King Josiah, approximately 40 years before the destruction. After that, nothing. Not in the Babylonian conquest narrative. Not in the lists of plunder. Not in the accounts of the return from exile. Not in the description of the rebuilding of the Second Temple. The most important object in the ancient world vanished, and nobody in 3,000 years of searching has found it. But that is only the beginning of the mystery, because the ark is only one piece of what may have been the greatest collection of sacred objects ever assembled, the treasure of Solomon's temple. And the question of what happened to that treasure, where it went, who took it, and whether any of it survives anywhere on earth today has driven kings and crusaders and scholars and adventurers to the edges of the known world for 3,000 years. Welcome to this channel, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand the mystery of Solomon's treasure, you first need to understand what Solomon's temple actually was, because the popular imagination has a picture significantly different from what the historical and archaeological evidence suggests. The popular picture is of an enormous gold-covered palace of God built by a king of legendary wisdom and wealth. This picture comes primarily from the first book of Kings and the second book of Chronicles, which describes Solomon as a ruler of incomparable power, trading in gold and horses and spices, receiving the Queen of Sheba, accumulating 700 wives and 300 concubines, and producing a body of wisdom literature that includes Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. The archaeological picture is considerably more complicated. The problem is that the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is one of the most politically sensitive sites in the world, currently the location of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Systematic archaeological excavation is politically impossible. The Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University has argued extensively that 10th century BCE Jerusalem was a relatively modest highland town not the magnificent imperial capital the biblical text describes, and that the elaborate descriptions of Solomon's wealth are later literary constructions projecting the grandeur of later periods onto an idealized past. This does not mean Solomon did not exist or that no temple was built. It means the historical reality was probably more modest than the biblical presentation. But the absence of archaeological evidence does not mean the absence of historical reality. The Temple Mount has not been systematically excavated. We do not know what is under it. And the existence of the Davidic dynasty, once dismissed as literary fiction, was confirmed by the Tel Dan inscription discovered in 1993, which refers explicitly to the House of David. The question of Solomon's treasure cannot be settled by archaeology alone. It requires following the textual trail, the historical record, the traditions preserved in multiple independent sources, and asking where they converge. Let us start with what the Bible itself says about the fate of the temple treasure, because the biblical account is considerably more complicated than the simple narrative of Babylonian conquest and plunder. The first book of Kings describes Solomon accumulating 666 talents of gold per year, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 billion annually at modern prices, gold shields, gold vessels, a throne of ivory overlaid with gold, silver as common as stones in Jerusalem during Solomon's reign. But Solomon's temple was looted not once but multiple times before the Babylonian destruction. The first looting happened during the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, approximately 20 years after the temple's completion. The Egyptian pharaoh Shishak, identified by Egyptologists with Shoshenq Privai, whose own records of this campaign survive on the walls of the temple at Karnak in Egypt, invaded Judah and took the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took everything. Rehoboam replaced the gold shields with bronze ones. The gold was gone within one generation. Subsequent kings raided the treasury to pay foreign powers. The temple was stripped and partially restored and stripped again over 3 centuries. By the time of the Babylonian conquest, what exactly remained is genuinely unclear, but the ark is absent from every inventory, and that absence is the central mystery. So where did the ark go? There are 5 serious theories, each supported by historical evidence of varying quality, each leading to a different place on the map. The first theory is that the ark was hidden before the Babylonian conquest by priests who saw what was coming. The second book of Maccabees, included in the Catholic and Orthodox biblical canons, contains a remarkable passage in which the prophet Jeremiah, guided by divine instruction, takes the Ark of the Covenant along with the tent of meeting and the altar of incense to Mount Nebo in what is now Jordan, hides them in a cave, and blocks the entrance. When companions try to mark the path for later retrieval, Jeremiah rebukes them and says, "The place shall remain unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy." This passage appears in what many traditions consider canonical scripture. It specifically identifies Mount Nebo as the hiding place, and it has never been followed up by a credible archaeological expedition, partly because the political situation makes such an expedition extremely complicated, and partly because the passage itself says the location will remain hidden until God chooses to reveal it. The second theory has generated the most popular fascination and the most serious investigation: the Ethiopian theory. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained for centuries that the Ark is in Ethiopia, specifically in a small chapel called the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the town of Aksum in northern Ethiopia. The Ethiopian claim is preserved in a 14th century text called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, which tells a story the tradition claims is far older than its written form. According to the Kebra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopian tradition as Makeda, visited Solomon in Jerusalem. She and Solomon had a son, Menelik I, who grew up in Ethiopia and later traveled to Jerusalem to visit his father. Before Menelik left Jerusalem with a group of young Israelite nobles, they secretly took the ark and replaced it with a replica. By the time Solomon discovered what had happened, Menelik was already en route to Ethiopia, and a divine cloud was said to be traveling with the group, indicating God's approval. The ark is in Aksum. It has been there, according to this tradition, for nearly 3,000 years. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church guards it with a seriousness that should give any skeptic pause. There is a guardian priest who lives with the ark, chosen for life, who can never leave the chapel compound from the moment of his appointment. Only this guardian priest is permitted to see whatever is in that chapel. No outsider, no visiting dignitary, no scholar, no journalist has ever been permitted access. The journalist Graham Hancock, whose 1992 book, The Sign and the Seal, is the most thorough popular investigation of the Ethiopian claim, spent years investigating the tradition and concluded that the evidence, while not conclusive, was significantly stronger than Western scholarship had acknowledged. He traced the tradition through medieval European accounts, Islamic historical sources, and the Ethiopian Chronicles themselves, finding a consistency and antiquity to the claim that he found impossible to dismiss. The Ethiopian tradition also holds that the Ark spent time on an island in Lake Tana called Tana Kirkos before reaching Aksum, and the monastic community there has maintained this claim for centuries, showing visitors what they describe as temple vessels from that period. The third theory takes us south and east to Arabia. The Islamic tradition has a complex and rich engagement with Solomon, who appears in the Quran as the prophet Suleiman, a king of supernatural power who commanded the wind, ruled over jinn and animals, and possessed a throne of incomparable magnificence. In various Islamic historical sources, including the medieval geographer al-Tabari, there are references to Solomon's treasure and its ultimate fate that do not appear in biblical sources. Some traditions place elements of the treasure in Yemen, in locations associated with pre-Islamic religious traditions of the Arabian Peninsula. The city of Marib, probable site of the ancient Sabaean capital and possible location of the Queen of Sheba's court, has yielded extraordinary pre-Islamic artifacts over centuries of excavation and looting. No confirmed temple objects have emerged, but the tradition persists. The fourth theory has the most direct textual support in a document discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Copper Scroll theory. Among the scrolls discovered near Qumran between 1947 and 1956, there was one completely unlike all the others. While the other scrolls were written on leather or papyrus and contained religious texts, this one was written on copper and contained a list. 64 locations describing where treasure had been hidden, with quantities of gold and silver that, when scholars have attempted to calculate them, run to somewhere between 65 and 200 tons. These are quantities that strain credibility, which is why many scholars have argued the Copper Scroll is literary or liturgical rather than practical. But the Copper Scroll has details too specific and too mundane to be purely symbolic. It does not describe treasure in the language of biblical poetry. It describes it in the language of a practical inventory. In the cistern beneath the steps, turn east 40 cubits. There you will find silver vessels weighing 17 talents. This is the language of someone who actually hid something and wanted to find it again. The scholar John Allegro, one of the original team assigned to publish the Dead Sea Scrolls, was convinced the Copper Scroll described real hidden treasure and spent years attempting to locate it. Multiple expeditions have followed. None have succeeded, partly because the descriptions use reference points that no longer exist, and partly because 2,000 years of building and rebuilding in and around Jerusalem have transformed the landscape beyond recognition. What the Copper Scroll's treasure actually is, whether it is the temple treasury hidden before the Babylonian conquest, the Qumran community's wealth hidden before the Roman assault, or the Second Temple treasury hidden before the destruction of 70 CE, remains an open question. The fifth theory is the one most enthusiastically adopted by popular culture and most dismissed by mainstream scholarship, but with textual roots going back to the earliest medieval period. The theory that Solomon's treasure was found by the Knights Templar during the Crusades. The Knights Templar were a military religious order founded in Jerusalem around 1119 CE. Their headquarters was the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, which the Crusaders believed was built on the site of Solomon's stables. From the beginning, there were rumors that their real purpose was something other than pilgrim protection. The medieval chronicler Walter Map reports rumors that the Templars were engaged in excavations beneath the Temple Mount. Archaeological investigations beneath the Western Wall have found extensive tunnel systems, some showing signs of having been entered in the medieval period. Whether the Templars found anything is a question the available evidence cannot answer. What is documented is that the Templars accumulated extraordinary wealth over 2 centuries, wealth that allowed them to function as the first international banking system in European history, lending money to kings and popes, maintaining a financial network of sophistication that had no precedent in European history. The order was dissolved in 1307 by the French king Philip IV, who was deeply in debt to the Templars and had the Grand Master Jacques de Molay arrested on charges of heresy. But when Philip's agents arrested the Templars in France on the morning of Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, the Templar treasury was not there. The ships that had been in the Templar port of La Rochelle were gone. The treasure had disappeared in the days before the arrests and has never been found. The most credible theories point to Scotland, outside the reach of papal authority, where Robert the Bruce had nothing to lose and potentially much to gain by offering the Templars refuge. Now, step back and consider what we have traced. The treasure of Solomon's temple was partially looted by the Egyptians in the 10th century BCE. It was repeatedly raided over 3 centuries. It was partially taken by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, though the ark does not appear on any Babylonian inventory. Some of it may have been hidden before the conquest at Mount Nebo. Some of it, according to Ethiopian tradition, was taken to Africa centuries before the conquest. The Copper Scroll describes 64 hiding locations for quantities of gold and silver that strain belief. And elements of whatever remained were possibly found by the Templars 1,000 years later. These accounts are not all compatible, they cannot all be true, but they are all old. They predate the modern period in which conspiracy theories about Solomon's treasure became a cottage industry. They appear in sources written by people with no apparent motive to invent them, and they converge on the same basic claim: the treasure is real, it was hidden, and it is somewhere. Here is something that almost nobody in popular discussions of this topic addresses. The Second Temple, massively expanded by Herod the Great in the decades before the birth of Jesus, was also sacked. The Roman general Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE and carried off its treasures in a triumph depicted on the Arch of Titus in Rome, which still stands today. The relief shows Roman soldiers carrying the 7-branched menorah through the streets of Rome. The menorah from the Second Temple is more historically tractable than the Ark because we know it was in Rome. The Roman historian Josephus, who witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, confirms that the temple menorah and other sacred objects were taken to Rome and displayed in Vespasian's Temple of Peace. When the Vandals sacked Rome in 455 CE, they took the temple treasures to Carthage. When the Byzantine general Belisarius defeated the Vandals in 533 CE, he took the treasures to Constantinople. Then, according to the Byzantine historian Procopius, an advisor warned Emperor Justinian that the treasures were cursed and had brought disaster to everyone who possessed them. Justinian sent them back to Jerusalem. And then they disappear again. There is no record of what happened to the temple menorah after the 6th century CE. The menorah could be anywhere. Like everything else associated with Solomon's treasure, there is one archaeological discovery that puts all of this in perspective, that grounds the entire mystery and physical reality in a way that no amount of textual evidence can. In 1979, the Israeli archaeologist Gabriel Barkay was excavating rock-cut tombs in an area of Jerusalem called Ketef Hinnom, just outside the old city walls. In one of the tombs, he found 2 tiny silver scrolls, so small they fit in the palm of a hand. Unrolling them took years of painstaking work. When they were finally read, the text was a version of the priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. These are the oldest known examples of a biblical text written on any material. They date to approximately the 7th century BCE, the period just before the Babylonian conquest. They were worn as amulets by people buried in tombs outside Jerusalem in the last years before everything was destroyed. They are not treasure in the conventional sense, but they are something more important. They are evidence that the world described in the biblical texts was real. That people in 7th century BCE Jerusalem wore the words of the Torah next to their skin. That the temple and the culture and the sacred objects described in those texts were not literary inventions, but historical realities. And if the people who wore those amulets were real, then the objects associated with their temple were real. Gold does not evaporate. Silver does not evaporate. The Ark of the Covenant, if it existed, did not simply cease to exist. It went somewhere. Someone took it somewhere. Someone hid it or destroyed it or preserved it with a devotion that has kept its location secret for 2,500 years. And the question of where it went is not merely a treasure hunter's question. It is a historical question of the first order. Because whatever happened to the Ark happened at one of the most consequential moments in human history. The moment when the religion that would eventually produce both Christianity and Islam lost its central sacred object and was forced to reimagine itself without it. The Judaism that emerged from the Babylonian exile was profoundly different from the Judaism that went into it. It was a Judaism without a temple, without an ark, without the physical dwelling place of God. It was a Judaism that had to find God somewhere other than in a gold-covered box in a stone building in Jerusalem. That reimagination produced the synagogue and the Torah scroll, and the rabbi and the prayer service, and the textual tradition that is the foundation of Western civilization. The loss of the Ark forced Judaism to become something that could survive without a physical center, and that transformation changed the world. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Worth arguing about in the comments with everyone who has a different answer. If the Ark of the Covenant were found tomorrow, what would happen? Not as a question about treasure hunting, as a question about the world we live in. The Temple Mount is currently the site of two of the most important mosques in Islam. Jewish tradition holds that the third temple will be built on the same site. Christian eschatology has its own relationship to the Temple Mount and the end of days. The political situation in Jerusalem is already so volatile that a single act of vandalism can trigger regional violence. What would happen if someone found the Ark? If someone emerged with an object that billions of people believe is the literal dwelling place of the God of Abraham, containing the tablets of the law written by the finger of God, would it unite the Abrahamic traditions in a moment of shared awe? Or would it become the most dangerous object in the world, a physical focal point for the oldest and most irresolvable conflict on earth? The treasure of Solomon may have been hidden not because anyone wanted to steal it, but because whoever hid it understood something we are only beginning to appreciate, that some objects are too powerful to exist in the open, that some things are safer buried, that the most sacred objects in the world are sometimes best protected by being lost. Perhaps the Ark is in a cave on Mount Nebo. Perhaps it is in a chapel in Oxum. Perhaps it is in a tunnel beneath Jerusalem that nobody has yet thought to dig in exactly the right place. Perhaps a Babylonian soldier melted it down in 586 BCE, and its gold decorated a temple to Marduk that itself no longer exists. We do not know, and that not knowing is itself one of the most important facts about the human relationship with the sacred. We built the most sacred objects our civilization has ever produced. We lost them. And 3,000 years later, we are still looking. Because some searches matter not because of what you find, but because of what the searching makes of you. Every person who has gone looking for the Ark has come back changed, not because they found it, because they were willing to go looking, because they took seriously the possibility that the world contains things of ultimate importance that have been lost and that might, with enough dedication and enough humility, be found again. The treasure is real. Some of it, at least, we already have. Written on silver, worn next to someone's skin, buried in a tomb, found in 1979. Read today in every language the people of Abraham have ever spoken. The Lord bless you and keep you.